If you're preparing for a tech interview like I was a few years ago, you need to know how to implement memoization. And in today's video, I'm going to be going over what memoization is, when to use it, and if you stay at the end, there's going to be an extra tip around the useMemo hook in React. Memoization is one of those fancy words you hear in interviews, basically used to gauge the literacy of the interview candidate. But memoization is also an optimization technique used primarily to speed up computer programs by storing the results of a function into a pure function and using the cached result whenever the same input comes up again. It's basically an object that memorizes the results of a function, which are basically the values in that object, and the keys can be the input for our function. Memoization especially shines when used to memoize expensive functions that are often being invoked with the same parameters. For example, if you're trying to memoize the results of a sum function, that's not really gonna help much, and it's only gonna increase the memory usage of your application. But here I have an example of an expensive function, basically simulated an expensive function, and how memoizing can help in this case. So let's go over the not memoized example first. We have an expensive function here which basically returns the sum of two parameters, but also has a 2-second timer in between, which basically makes the expensive function run for 2 seconds. And this is to simulate a function that will run for 2 seconds. And we have the execution, basically just calling the expensive function multiple times. If you can see here, I have the same parameters multiple times, and then one for different, just for the example. Now if you run this also outputs the date, the current date, and we can see that each of these will be 2 seconds apart, which means the full execution of our code took 8 seconds. Let's go over the memoized example, and now here I have the same expensive function, the same execution, but I also have a memoized function here which basically has a cache, which is an object, and then when we call the memoized function, it constructs a key which is basically the A parameter comma B parameter. It checks if the cache object already has this, and if it does, then returns it from the object, so it doesn't run the expensive function multiple times for the same parameters. And if it doesn't find it in the cache object, then it's gonna run the expensive function, put it in the cache object so we can use it later and return the result. And if you run this, we can see how much each of these takes to run. So you can see the first one took 2 seconds, the second one took 2 seconds, then the third and the fourth one basically run at the same time, because now we had the results of the expensive function with parameters 1 and 2 already stored in our cache. And that's basically what memoization is, keeping the results over a function in some kind of cache where we can construct the key however we want it. We can JSON stringify it or whatever, and then before we actually execute the expensive function, we check if this is stored in our cache object. There are some useful tips around how you construct the key. For example, the sum of 1 and 2 will be the same as the 2 plus 1, but in this case I haven't made it robust enough to figure that out. So I think if you have multiple parameters, you can always sort them, so that way it will store the key and look for the same key even though the parameters are going to be in different places. But I'm not really going to go into that. It's just a tip to make sure that the key is constructed good enough to not invoke the expensive function multiple times. And depending on the use case, sometimes it will be useful to invalidate the cache or not cache the result at all. For example, if you are trying to memoize the response of a different service, you would want to invalidate that cache whenever the data in that service changes, because now you have new data, you want to get the result from the service itself. Or if the service returns an error, for example the server is down, you wouldn't want to cache an error because the next time it's going to run, maybe the error is gone. So those are just 2 examples I'm throwing out there because I've had use cases for that before. Just think about how you're invalidating your cache, how long does it exist for, and keep those things in mind whenever you use memoization. React provides its own hook called useMemo for memoization. Now this basically works in the same way as the example I shown before, but it is being executed in a slightly different way. And the same warning is valid here. Memoization adds memory overhead, so it should only be used when absolutely necessary. And also, because this is a React hook, it follows the same React hook rules. For example, you can only invoke the useMemo hook in the top level of your component. You can't really use it in other hooks and stuff like that. And I also think it's very important to note here that useMemo doesn't really give you a way to clear the cache or invalidate it in any way. And there are some situations where the cache is cleared by React automatically, for example, when the file changes. There's also a very famous example of using memoization in a recursive function that calculates the Fibonacci sequence. And there's a lot of different examples of this out there, so I'm not really going to include in this video, but I just wanted to mention it. Now, when they ask you what memoization is and how to implement in your next interview, hopefully you'll know. And that's been it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. Enjoy the rest of your day. Happy coding. Bye.